I'm here with John and Paul today. We're going to talk about prophecy and spiritual gifts in the church. All of us have some amount of charismatic background. We're from Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, so I think that makes us something like the Frozen Chosen this past month. So I'm curious to hear where this conversation will go. This conversation was kind of started on the Discord server maybe a month ago, something like that, talking about various experiences with prophecy in the church and how it got started. I don't know if you guys want to kind of maybe introduce yourselves a little bit. I think, John, this is your first Randos maybe appearance, if I'm remembering correctly. Paul, you have your own YouTube channel and you've talked with PVK, I think at least twice, maybe 3 times, something like that. And John was on PVK's channel for the first time maybe 2 months ago, something like that. Mm-hmm. So I think this should be a good conversation.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So I guess I can go first in introductions. I'm John, like you said. I'm a college student, almost graduated, but I grew up in a charismatic, a non-denominational kind of evangelical church, very Bethel adjacent. So the sort of, tongues, flag waving, dancing, all of that stuff, totally normal. And since then I've kind of moved in a more sacramental direction in my theology, but I'm also looking to maintain a lot of the good things that I saw out of the charismatic stuff, while also, picking apart some of the stuff that was, suboptimal, let's say. So.
Yeah, I'm Paul Anleitner. As Sam said, I host a podcast at my YouTube. I'm trying to be a little more active there. For whatever reason, I've just found little connection on YouTube compared to the audio only podcast, which makes sense to me. I don't know how PVK holds people's attention for a 3-hour video breakdown on Jordan Peterson or something on that format, So for me, I listen to Paul, usually via audio podcast, so I can do other things at the same time. So my background, I grew up in a non-denominational, charismatic, but so I'm 37. John, you're
I'm 22.
22. So. Sam, how old are you?
32.
32. Okay. So, it's funny when you say, you grew up in a Bethel adjacent church, and, Bethel Reading, that is, there's a Bethel seminary that I'm an alum of in St. Paul, which has no affiliation, very, very different. So
yes, definitely.
So Bethel and Reading, it's funny when you say you grew up in that. I don't want to be like the old man sitting on his porch here, because I'm not, but I remember, well, what would that have been? 2006, 2007, being out in Reading before anybody knew it. And I detest the practice of name dropping, but just to give some context for how relatively new the Bethel phenomenon is. I mean, I remember sitting in Brian and Jen Johnson's living room back when they only had like one record out, and they were just a church that miracles were happening at. So I grew up in a church setting that was actually, especially by the 90s, had really moved into like the prosperity gospel, word of faith movement. So I frequently joke, anybody that's listened to my podcast before knows I've brought up fondly and not completely fondly at the same time. I've joked about how I grew up, and my parents, as part of my summer chores, I had to read a chapter every day from Kenneth Copeland's daily devotional. So we had Kenneth Copeland on in the house, Ken Hagin, Oral Roberts. Those were fixtures of my childhood. And then as I got into my college years, unlike John, I didn't move in a sacramental direction. That's a kind of relatively in evangelical circles and in charismatic circles, but even more recent phenomenon. I moved deeper into what is sometimes called like the latter rain movement. And that is, I didn't even know it as that at the time. And as I got into my early ministry years, so that's really the world of Bethel, International House of Prayer, charismatic, prophetic conferences. Every conference that you would go to in this world has either a lion or an eagle on the brochure. Um, legit conferences that I have ministered at in the past were called things like Prophetic Fire and Glory 2, to differentiate from the first conference, like it was the sequel. So I was really, really deeply immersed in that world. For years, I was like a prophetic worship leader. So my job, and it's going to be fun to talk about this together, but my job was not just to, like, those of you that are in either liturgical church settings or more, down the center evangelical church settings, the role of the worship pastor is to maybe either facilitate liturgy, like my current role is, which includes elements of singing, maybe other things, or to lead the congregation in song. The prophetic worship leader is much more, and I've talked with John Vervaeke about this, it's much more like a shaman.
Mm-hmm.
and that might be upsetting to some of you in those contexts, and I don't mean it as such, but it is to essentially like mediate as the voice of God, to open up everybody in the room, we wouldn't have called it this, to the flow state,
Mm-hmm.
to be open to the Spirit's working in the room, to facilitate encounters, right? A lot of language of encounter, experience, presence, and there's a lot of really good things about that I do want to hold on to. So I was in those contexts till really like 2012. Just to give you guys like the timeline for it. And there was a few things that made me go, hey, I think I actually want to move beyond this. It really wasn't so much a deconstruction as much as like, I want to build additions on this house of faith. And there's some remodeling that's been done. But yeah, that's a bit of my background and past experience in charismatic culture.
Sure. I'll try and keep this a little bit brief. This is probably a part of my theological background I don't think I've mentioned before in this corner of the internet. So back in the 60s, so I wasn't born yet, right? I already said I'm 32 years old. I was born in 1988. So my dad grew up, I don't know, kind of liberal Protestant, really kind of lukewarm liberal Protestant, and was, a child of the 60s, and, listened to the Beatles and Bob Dylan and searched for spiritual insight. And I'll just say did other sorts of things that people at that time did. And in college, he got born again into an organization or group called the Way International, which is sort of it virtually doesn't exist anymore, but it got really big in like the 60s and 70s among baby boomer, Jesus freak kind of people. And it was very unique. It pulled theological influences from a lot of different things. And one of its big influence pulls was from oneness Pentecostalism, I think. I think the leader had somehow gotten a big dose of that, but it was also, that's where the non-Trinitarianism comes from. And it was like, very charismatic, very dispensationalist, non-Trinitarian, annihilationist. And it was like a whole bunch of weird ingredients, right? That in a sort of novel combination. And kind of it turned from this like hippie movement into essentially a personality cult, with a lot of the ugly things that go along with that, financial, sexual manipulation by the leader and leaders and stuff like that, by the 80s. And then the leader died. Paul or Victor Werewolf is his name. He died and before I was born. And then so there was like hundreds of thousands of people associated with this thing. It was a decently big deal. And then like all of them, kind of scatter, go their own way. And so I grew up in a church that was like a reconstituted, kind of like, we're going to leave a lot of the bad aside, but try and build a new thing out of it from people from the Way International. And so like we were So it's like, I didn't grow up in a cult. I grew up in a thing that's very self-consciously was not a cult, right?
Yeah.
But all of my parents' generation had come out of something that had kind of progressed from this cool new spiritual hippie movement into essentially a personality cult over the course of 20, 30 years. But the charismatic part was interesting because it's like a very different flavor. Like, there was no flag waving in my church. There was no ecstatic running around or anything like that. We were sort of like the buttoned up kind of charismatics. Like, as part of our liturgy, of course, we didn't call it a liturgy, but and by the time I was 13, I was one of the guitar players in the worship band too. And so, like, we would, as part of our church service, we would call on people to speak in tongues and interpret their own tongues. Like, John Doe, please stand up, speak in tongues and interpret. And they would stand up, speak in tongues for 30 seconds, interpret their tongues for 30 seconds, sit down. And then we'd call on 2 or 3 people like that. And then we would call on someone to stand up and prophesy. And they would, give a prophecy for, a couple minutes like that, sit down.
Could they pass? Could they say, I pass if it comes to them? You're like, that's
So
pretty intense.
Pressure,
yeah.
It is pretty intense, right? And so, like, so at certain points, like when I was like 17, 18, I was the person who would call on people sometimes. And like, I knew who could and couldn't do it, who wasn't comfortable, right? Like,
there was prophetic hierarchy. Yeah.
There was like 20, 25 people who could speak in tongues comfortably in that way. And, I would try and mix it up a little bit. And there was maybe like 5, 10 people who were probably the prophet people. And, you kind of kept a mental register of that. And I would, try and feel led by the Spirit to pick the people, that sort of thing. And so it was certainly charismatic, right? But it was a very different format than I've seen almost anywhere else, where it was like part of the liturgy and it was very self-controlled, right? Like, you speak in tongues now and stop at an appropriate time length, right? And everyone listens to you. And like, the prophecies and stuff like that weren't, it's going to snow a foot next Tuesday. So, John Doe over there, you need to upgrade your snowblower, right? It wasn't, anything ever like that. Most of the prophecies were, basically, it sounded like someone was making up their own psalm on the spot that was just sort of vaguely reassuring, nice, kind of fluffy-ish words from God. And this was something, I forget who was asking about it, but the person prophesying or interpreting tongues, because interpreting tongues is often basically very similar to prophesying, you would speak from the voice of God most of the time. Like, I, the Lord, say to you, yada, yada, yada. And it's
in
like
King James, right?
Yeah.
Right. In King James English. Yeah. With thous and these and doths and stuff like that. But then sometimes it was from like the voice of the prophet or something, like, or like the prophetic voice. Like, it wasn't God, but it wasn't the person talking either. It was like, yeah, I don't know exactly how to describe it, but saying like nice things about God, right? Acclaiming God or giving praise to Jesus and stuff like that in the prophetic voice, but it wasn't like the person talking, but it wasn't God. I'm like, it's one of those things you grow up in it and you never really think about it, right? It's just normal. But then when you step back and think about it, it's like, well, wait a minute, what exactly were we doing? What's going on? So I would say, I think that it wasn't particularly life influential, the sort of prophecies that we were giving, right? It was more just kind of, I don't know, horoscope fluff about how nice God was and how much God loved us in various aspects of like the gospel or forgiveness or stuff like that. But every once in a while people would come up to each other. This was more common like after the church service, right? That I think God was telling me that you blah, 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 blah. Right.
A word of knowledge.
A word of knowledge
Yep.
to individual people. And so that was a whole nother realm of this. So I don't know. I think I'll stop there in my background. But so that was sort of the charismatic flavor that I came from.
Yeah, it almost sounds more like old school Pentecostal than say
definitely.
second or third wave charismatic, which is
Right,
interesting.
right, because it kind of got its influence from oneness Pentecostalism in like the 40s or the 50s, right? So it's like it was like a download of that form of Pentecostalism that just kind of stayed in place until the present. It wasn't quite like the Bethel stuff. It was like an old school type of Pentecostalism.
Yeah, I'm glad you said something about that, John, because there are distinct flavors, and it's really hard from the outside. Some people just lump Pentecostalism and charismatic culture together, and there's overlap. The Venn diagram, it would be there's plenty of overlap, but it's really hard to describe with language the distinct notes and flavors that you would experience in a traditional Pentecostal church from what you might say is either like a latter rain charismatic influence church culture. And again, there's overlapping practices, but there was different. So I grew up in we didn't call ourselves charismatic. And that was the other thing too. That was like, we used terms like full gospel as opposed to the church down the street that only had half gospel. We said we were a spirit-filled church.
Yeah.
Versus
or we believe in the manifestations of the Spirit, or
right. Yeah. Or in our particular context, especially by the mid-90s, we'd say like, well, we're a church that believes in faith. Believes in faith, which is funny.
Messing with Paul there,
But I also had a mentor that was in a Pentecostal church and would invite me over to their like small Pentecostal church that would invite me to their really small church conferences and to come play, like you mentioned, Sam, in charismatic culture, oftentimes the doorway into any sort of ministry is through music, because music's the main course. The preaching is secondary in most places, right? Which is different in your tradition, or not traditional. The traditional is a sliding scale, but we might just consider the your General Baptist church or a free church or something like that, where the preaching is the main course and the singing or the music portion of the liturgy or the worship service is kind of like sometimes the warm up, it feels like, if you ask some worship leaders and pastors, but not like that in charismatic culture. But I don't know why was I saying that? Oh, it is a doorway for most people to get involved in some way when you were young. Because when you said you picked up the guitar and were playing at 13, that was the case for me. I mean, I learned guitar because I just wanted to learn Nirvana songs and Pearl Jam songs. And then they were like, well, you should play in the worship team. And it was really good. I'm glad I did. They gave me a platform, and which I probably shouldn't have had, but it was really like meaningful because you knew you were part of the main course.
Yeah, it was Blink 182 for me to show a generational difference. But yeah, it was like from Blink 182 song to, oh, Sam, you can play the guitar, get up on stage. Yeah,
that's right. But so I remember what I was saying. I would go over to this mentor's church. It was Pentecostal. And while at our charismatic church, here's like a distinct note of difference, like a slight flavor difference that you wouldn't be able to get unless you're like a wine connoisseur and you can pick up the distinct notes and flavors.
That's a good point.
So in our worship, like in our singing at my home church, we'd usually go for like 45 minutes straight of singing. And then if things really felt like they were cooking, pastor would get up and just be like, I'm not preaching today, and we'll just do the whole service, right? And those were limited occasions. The songs, for the most part, were still like, we are copying Hillsong to the T until we get to the end of the song. And then we're going to have like, this is the time where we sing in tongues, for the most part. Now, there was like a revival that broke out when I was a freshman in high school, where that script kind of got broken. And it was like, we're not just like these songs, we're going to like weave in and out of spontaneous singing, and we're going to weave in and out of singing in tongues in the middle of the song. But for the most part, the script was, we're going to sing this song pretty straight, just like Hillsong does it, early mid 90s Hillsong, which was a thing. We're going to hit that, or, Maranatha music or Vineyard tunes. And then at the end, we'll all just kind of sing in tongues together. At this mentor's Pentecostal church, it was it was dancing, like the intensity of the dancing too. And there was a lot of just like,
Mhm.
and it was white, it was a white church. So I'm not talking about like a praise break in a black Pentecostal or Baptist church, which also has that, the dancing plays a central role. But, there was a lot more, gosh, I don't know how to describe this distinction. There was a greater emphasis on tongues, even though we really believed in tongues in our home church. So I'm just,
Yeah.
that just got me thinking about some of those distinct flavor differences.
And you mentioned the white and black thing a little bit. I think part of, honestly, what helped shape Pentecostal kind of worship practices was that it was really one of the first church traditions in the US to be pretty integrated and to bring white and black worship styles together. And
Totally.
so I think the emphasis on music and sort of that participatory musical, focus was really something that had been in the Black church tradition in America for a long time, and then kind of got merged into the Pentecostal tradition because, it was right in the early 1900s, right? The Azusa Street and all that stuff. And it was some of the first integrated churches were the Pentecostal movement. And my church growing up was like 40-50% black.
Totally.
And that was part of what I think, brought that heavier emphasis on music as opposed to the sermon, which would have been the more traditional white denomination kind of influence.
Yeah, I
Right.
experienced the same thing too, where it was growing up, it's almost weird to me when I talk to people who have grown up in other evangelical contexts that were like, man, we really wish we had like more black leadership in our church. And I was like, well, my crazy, lots of good people there, but in a lot of ways, really dysfunctional church. And one thing we had right away was no problem with black leadership,
Yeah.
women preaching. It wasn't a thing and didn't even think about it. But I should say there is, just like historically, there was a pretty nasty racial divide that did end up happening in Pentecostalism later. I think once you get into like our time, we start seeing more of a unification, but there's a split that's still there between the Assemblies of God and the Church of God in Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Those were both part of like Azusa Street style Pentecostalism. And I don't want to say a particular date because I know I would get it wrong, but there was a racial split that happened. The white church, Pentecostal church, became Assemblies of God, and then the black church was Church of God in Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Not Church of God, Anderson, Tennessee. That's a different Church of God, but COGIC,
Yeah.
sometimes just
Yeah.
go Kojic, right? Church
Yeah.
of God in Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And that divide has still remained. And by and large part, you would still see now some of this is changing in the Assemblies of God over the past 10 years or so. But by and large part, if you went you were in the 90s and it was like, all right, I'm going to check out two different Pentecostal churches. If it was Assemblies of God, it was predominantly white.
Yeah.
And if still today, Church of God in Christ is
Is a black
predominantly
denomination.
Right.
it's a black
Mhm.
denomination,
Mhm.
so.
Yeah, and I think one of the differences, the things that happen in the charismatic movement and Pentecostal that I think, a lot of people maybe don't understand that are in that not in those contexts, like, for the past, 500 years, say Lutheran churches have been doing largely the same kind of thing. There's been changes, I'm sure, but like, you give, Pentecostalism and charismaticism like 100 years since Azusa Street, and like it's all over the place, right? And one of the I mean, one of the big differences I see is like a difference in authority and how that's perceived. Because if you have a church hierarchy, if you have bishops, if you have even Protestants have a lot of tradition, going back to Luther and Calvin and others. But on the other hand, for us, it's more like it's the movement of the Spirit. It's whatever the Spirit is doing. And like, to go back on one of your points earlier, Paul, it's like the church that I've grew up in it's been around for, 100 years or so. but even within that individual church, there's been a lot of shift, and like it just shows the influence of a place like Bethel and IHOP and Hillsong to a lesser degree in our church. But
and not the pancake place for people.
Yeah, yeah, International House of Prayer. Yeah,
Kansas City. Yeah.
Right. But my dad and my his friends and like the elders of the church now, it's like they were all there. They were going down to IHOP when it was popping back in the late 2000s and over to Bethel. And so these things, they spread like fire, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think to kind of tack a little bit on the prophetic stuff, one of the things, the differences that we've seen in, and this is only in the last 20 years, is that someone like a prophet can give a prophecy to the whole world. They can broadcast themselves, live or YouTube recorded, whatever, which is, I think it's a massive difference from the previous, 2000 years of church history, because, both of you are familiar with some degree, at least, about the way that prophecy has played a role in church history, like the Montanists and, other groups. But all of that was done in local church contexts. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like you would give it to the local church and, that would be it. Whereas now,
the fastest way, perhaps you could write a couple copies of your letter, right, and then send it on foot or by boat to a couple other churches. That was the closest thing to mass production at the time.
Yeah. And now, like my mom is a huge fan of Chris Valentin at Bethel, and now she can, hear him prophesy about his, or at least give his opinions or whatever it might be about the state of the country. And it's been interesting to see this play out, especially like I know this with the 2020 election, this has really thrown a wrench in a lot of things in the prophetic. A lot of the cessationist folks will, this is the worst year for the prophetic ever, blah blah blah, and I think for me personally, and I'm still pretty young, so this is maybe a formative stage for me, but it did, shake my faith a little bit in the prophecy specifically, because
I guess in the gift of prophecy you're having questions about,
maybe,
or in the role of, because I think we might even need to differentiate, because there is, for some people that might be like, they're not cessationists, they're continuationists. They go, well, I still would maybe see there being value to the gift of prophecy, but yet they don't recognize, in our churches, it was like the fivefold office: apostle, prophet, evangelist, teacher,
yes.
right?
Yep.
This one, I don't know. And so there's an office of prophet where people actually, and many, you might just say like down the center evangelical churches, you got like a pastor,
elder, member.
Yeah.
Not yet a member.
Totally.
Yep.
So, but in Pentecostal and charismatic streams, you actually have not just an affirmation of the gift of prophecy still being at work today, but many affirm the office of the prophet. And so I think, if I'm hearing you right, John, you're talking about, are you saying some of this stuff has made you call into question the validity of a office of the prophet at work in the church, or call into question, or at least bring up questions about like the gift of prophecy, or both?
Yeah, well, I think the difference, and I'm glad you brought this up because that's really important to understand the whole charismatic thing, but there's a distinction between, at least there seems to me, between, if you're treating the prophecy that correctly, there's a distinction between being in the office of the prophet and identifying, like, my identity is I am a prophet, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is conversations I've had with people who've been in this movement for a long time, is that when you start identifying as yourself, I am the prophet of God, thus saith the Lord, and I can say that with all confidence, because whatever, that's where you start running into trouble. And that's where I think this sort of ethos of personal experience and this sort of psychology that's kind of been an issue in Protestantism really comes to its worst head, in this sort of thing. And so, I think what I've been trying to wrestle with is how do we, because a lot of these prophecies that you hear from these prophetic figures, like 90-95% of the time they're talking about the church praying in and leaning into what God is doing and being faithful and being the faithful remnant. That's a term I've heard thrown around a lot. And it's only like 5% or so of it which leans towards future predictions, or I feel like I had this vision of this is what's happening. Like one of the prophets that my mom was listening to, he's an Australian, so he's not an American, but he basically had this vision of the church being like standing. There's these two big giants in America, and they're slugging against each other, and they're going to just take each other out, and the implication is they're going to destroy the country. And his vision was that the church is going to stand in the gap and basically put their hands up in front, in between these to bring peace and bring restoration and revival and etc. And when I hear something like that, I'm like, amen. Like that's clearly a true description of the underlying spiritual state of affairs in this country. But then it's like, well, Trump wins the election. It's kind of like part of the thing.
Same
and I'm
guy,
like,
same guy.
He thought that, he believed that Trump would win. He believed Trump would win re-election, and there were a lot of them like that, right? And so this guy, and specifically, he was actually very gracious about it. And like the second that it was pretty clear that Trump wasn't winning, he came out and apologized. And there were a few others like Chris Valton and others who came out. And I have a lot of respect for that, because that takes a lot of bravery, especially if you're putting yourself on the national airwaves. And then but a lot of far too many of these prophetic types on the internet haven't. And it's this sort of Frankenstein's monster of Republican conservative nationalism melded with this charismatic evangelical fervor, and it's just boiled over. And I've seen like very few prophets and very few charismatic contexts, I think, have been able to contain this adequately.
Right. And there is something weird about the mixture of politics and charismaticism in the US right now. And there were like, if you were to say evangelical Christians, how many vote Democrat, how many vote Republican, leans pretty heavily Republican. Everyone knows that. But that's also because the definition of evangelical has almost melded into the political definition, right? So it's almost, if like evangelical means white Christians who tend to vote Republican, and then it's like, well, 90-something% of white American Christians who tend to vote Republican voted Republican. It's like, well, it's just like a no true Scotsman at that point. But and then within evangelicalism, I think that the charismatic section was even more pro-Trumpy than the non-charismatic wing of evangelicalism. And Paul, you kind of talked about this.
Yeah, that's not new though.
Right.
So, and I can give you guys like a little bit of personal experience and history with this. But first, I think I want to say something about prophecy, because we're talking a lot about it, and it's maybe inside baseball. For those that don't, even in the wildest, most prophetic obsessed context I've ever inhabited, all of them said in theory, in theory, not always in practice, but in theory, our prophetic insights are bound to and answer to the scriptures. So no place was I ever at that said explicitly, we think somebody can hear from the Spirit today, and it carries the amount of authority that the apostles had and the writers of the New Testament had. No one ever said that. So
No one's
that,
writing a new book of the Bible in their
no,
prophecy.
no,
Right?
no, no.
Yeah,
So
no.
in theory, that was always the case. So you say, you take that um thing said by the guy in Australia, right? And you go, that resonates with me. Well, okay, there's a good question that I think charismatics need to have is how much of this, because what we're really talking about is we are talking about intuiting something. This is the, if we're, and this is really hard. Charismatics, we like, there's a lot of like deep Gnostic ontology
Yeah.
in charismatic circles.
Yeah.
That has, oh gosh, we could talk for hours just about that.
Yeah.
But part of that quasi-Gnostic ontology is that the mechanism by which we really discern reality is intuition. That's how we get secret insights into the true nature of the kingdom of God. And guys, this, I mean, gosh, I could just go on this forever. So I'm going to have to kind of hold back. The mechanism is intuition. It's, PVK has brought up, Pascal's spirit of finesse. We're not talking about rational syllogisms, logical deductions. We're not talking about that. We're talking about, man, I felt the spirit say this. Well, what do we, psychologically, we're talking about intuition, a process of intuiting something. So people intuit something, they discern something. I think it's a really valid, we need the intuition, we need the intuitive, we need the spirit of finesse. This is what we experience in poetry and music and art. It's not just, you can't break everything down to a logical syllogism. It's what we experience in love with someone else. Is like, I don't have the words. Like, I know when my wife is off, when she's having an off day. She knows when I'm off, even if I don't say anything to her. We can't rationally deduct it. She can intuit it.
Mhm.
And there is some validity to that. But so for people that aren't familiar with prophecy, even in charismatic contexts, people are essentially trying to intuit the spirit, to discern either the present tense will of God for someone. Like, you might be wrestling with a career decision. You can't go to the Bible for that. And you can even make a list of pros and cons.
Mhm.
But how do you know your pros and cons list is right?
Right.
So there's facets to this which are, I think are really, really valuable. So you might have that where you're like, I'm trying to discern the present tense will of God. You also might be trying to discern, like, what is the correct ethical action? And I don't just
Mhm.
mean should I sin or not sin, but the correct mode of being. And so a prophetic insight might be someone intuiting something that say, if you continue on this trajectory, this is where it's going to end. And you might go, okay, well, can I just like rationally figure that out? Well, I don't know. Like,
Mhm.
maybe, but we're really, really bad at predicting outcomes.
Right. And
Yeah.
like I kind of alluded to, for most of my church experience, prophecy really served the role of sort of encouraging the church.
Yes.
Yeah, like communicating the timeless theological truths in a way that resonated with the current circumstance where the church was at.
That's at its best, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the best use of it. I think that's still the biblical use. It's still the use I would affirm. I still affirm that there is a way in which the Spirit, and we do these things in tension. We should have separation of powers in this, where we have a checks and balance system. I'm trying to figure out a life decision, right? I have wisdom that I am trying to attune myself to, and there's various tracks to which I can become attuned to wisdom, to God's working in his will in the world. So I totally believe that. But here's where this stuff gets messy, is that there are some people that are really gifted in that. And then they think that intuiting becomes the entire method, the epistemological method for deducing all of reality. So I know, and I've been in circles. So, gosh, how long ago is this? 2006, 2007, 2008? What year is it? I don't know. 12, 13 years ago. So back during Barack Obama's first election cycle, I was deep in charismatic culture. I was traveling around the country, doing conferences, getting people from all across their cities together for these 24-hour-long prayer meetings. You know, an IHOP style, you're going to take a 2-hour set, you're going to worship and pray. And so we're doing these conferences with all of the biggest names in charismatic prophetic world. There wasn't social media, but I can tell you there was a website called, I think it's still in existence, called Elijah List.
Yeah.
Elijah List was the website. You could go buy prophetic music CDs, and all the prophets would submit a word to, I forget the guy that ran the website, and you'd see the word for the day. And this is where, that was like the beginning, before there was social media, where people would go to get these like intuitive insights into, well, what's the election going to turn out like? And then there was people's emails, right? So you'd sign up for an email list.
Email list. Yeah.
And then there was the conference. So like you're saying, Sam, you said, and you brought this up too, John, long ago, you might just have something within a local community where Sam calls out, dude in the third row, you know, and he's like, Trump's going to win the election. Well, you know, that's probably just going to stay in your church. But that guy's got a platform, and he's at a conference, and he's on Elijah List, and you sign up for your email, for his email list, that stuff's going to start to spread, but nowhere near as quickly as social media. So back in 2007, I'm deep in these circles, deep in them. And I'm in these green rooms, and I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus. These green rooms where I did not see a degree of sanctification that was any greater in any of these prophets than the guy that was doing sound or cleaning the toilets at the venue. It wasn't. But they had been elevated in the hierarchy because of their gift, right? And in all of our churches have hierarchies where we elevate people. Maybe it's on education and, you know, but in charismatic Pentecostal world, especially charismatic world, it is based on your charisma. Like, are you an extrovert? Are you possibly a narcissist?
Charisma in both senses of the word.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what did you have, like a third heaven access to the throne of God that we can somehow corroborate with you giving like a word of knowledge, with you laying hands on somebody and then being healed? So I'm in all these circles, right? And 2007, pretty, you know, it's my first foray being in that world during an election cycle. And every single one of these prophets were all saying, John McCain's going to win the election. This is the word of the Lord. Obama is the Antichrist. He's a Muslim. All of these things are being spread around in emails. God's going to here's one, like word for word, God is putting a Deborah in the White House. Who's the Deborah? It's Sarah Palin. Here's where I started to experience dissonance with this, guys. I started, first of all, to see all of these issues, and then I fast forward a few more years, and then it's like, oh, universal healthcare is an issue. And now I'm getting prophetic words from the local prophet that if universal healthcare passes, we're going to have, not universal, Obamacare passes, there's going to be judgment. If Prop 8 passes in California that allows for gay marriage, there's going to be judgment. And I noticed all of these issues are Republican issues.
Yeah.
Every candidate is a Republican.
I don't know. California is getting judged pretty hard right now, so maybe that one might not be wrong.
Yeah. Oh man. So you start seeing this thread, and then here's the thing that actually personally I experienced. And I've shared this a few times publicly before. I've never been like a political wonk. I wasn't really even following the election that closely, but I started having dreams before the primary even began. I should say right when the primary was beginning, and it looked like Hillary Clinton was going to be the nominee on the first go around, right?
Yep.
I started having dreams, and guys, I had never voted anything else than Republican at this time. I started having dreams that Barack Obama was going to be the president. And I've had freaky incidences of prophetic dreams that I could tell you guys about, and people wouldn't believe, over and over. And I didn't want him to be president either. I want to make this clear. I wasn't rooting for him. I didn't even know who he was. But even before that primary, first primary in Iowa, right? I was having dreams where I was sitting down meeting with him, and like, I knew this guy was going to be president. I would ask him in a dream, I'm like, "Oh, I know you're from Chicago. That's all I know. Are you a Cubs fan or a White Sox fan?" And the next day I would wake up and on TV would be Barack Obama in a White Sox hat. You know, I didn't Google this. This was, and I knew, I'm like, okay, something's going on here where I feel like I'm getting, through this mysterious process, a prophetic insight into what is going to happen. And I'm starting to pray for this guy. I still didn't vote for him, to be honest. I didn't vote for him. But I started to pray for this guy and to feel like a sense of like, man, I really need to start praying for this guy. But why is it that I have this really deep certainty through my prophetic insight, this guy's going to be president, and all of these other prophets are saying John McCain's going to be president? The final dream I had, I'm sorry I'm taking up too much airtime here,
That's fine.
It's fine. Yeah.
was everyone was saying at this point, all of these prophets were saying God's putting a Deborah in the White House. They really weren't wild about John McCain, but they were wild about Sarah Palin, charismatic, evangelical Christian, right?
Yeah. Not snooty, populist.
Yeah. I mean,
Mhm.
like in a fairly still narcissistic, masculine church culture, she's easy on the eyes too. Let's be honest. There were things about that people liked. So there's going to be a Deborah in the White House. I have a dream where I'm driving down the middle of a desert road somewhere. And all of a sudden, I look over on the side of the road, and there is John McCain's tour bus. It was called the Straight Talk Express. I still remember this in this dream. And it was broke down on the side of the road. I'm like, this is so weird. Dude, that's John McCain's tour bus, and he's the only one standing outside of it. So I go, I'm going to pull over and see if he needs any help. So I pull over and I go, and I'm like, you know, Mr. McCain, did your bus break down? He's like, yeah. He's like, but it's okay. Sarah's going to come and take me. She's going to come pick me up. She's going to get me where I need to go. And I was like, all right, well, I'll just wait here with you till she comes. And then, like, you know, weird inception dream time, I'm sitting here an hour, who knows how long it is actually in the dream time. I'm sitting here. She doesn't come. He hops on the phone. He's like, I'm going to try to get a hold of her. She's going to take me where I need to go. And this is right when he had announced that the vice president, that she was going to be his vice president candidate to run with him. And this is charisma. All the prophets were saying, this is it. It's the Deborah that God has called to put in the White House. And we waited and waited, and she never showed up, never got him to where he wanted to go. And I woke up going, oh, I know what this means. I've had all these dreams about Obama. She's not getting him to the White House. And then it was like that next week or two where she had that kerfuffle that everybody lambasted on Saturday Night Live, where she said she could see Russia from her backyard. And it was like, no, she didn't. So I bring that up to go, that was an instance where I knew right away, people can't tell the difference between their own political appetites and what they think they're intuiting. We see the meaning in the world that we usually already carry. And so when this stuff rolls around, I'm like, well, duh, nothing's changed. Of course, they're going to say Trump's president. Of course, Chris Valentin's going to say that. Of course, they get into QAnon. Of course, you know, all of these things. It doesn't shock me or surprise me because they've never learned. And hopefully this is the case for some of these people, that they finally are starting to see, boy, you know what? I can't sift through my own political appetites and worldview from the Spirit of God. So I wasn't shocked in the least bit when I saw this stuff. It's nothing new. It's been going on. And then in 2012, it was the same thing. Like, you know, Mitt Romney's God's guy. And then in 2016, it was Trump. And then in 2020, it's like, follow the thread, guys. Follow the causal pattern here. You're going to say that God's candidate is the person that you feel most political alignment with. And so instead of just saying this is who God's going to win, I just wish people would have and could be helped through a process of discernment. But it's really hard when the church and ministry structures put these people as CEOs of a spiritual corporation with no checks and balances. Somebody's got to come alongside and go, can you see this? you are not prophesying. You are uttering things that emerge from your own system of values. So just share, like, just be honest and be like, hey, I just like this candidate, and that's fine. But this is the word of the Lord. Golly, last thing I'll say, and I'll stop talking, guys. There's a guy I met years ago during this time, and he's got this really public Facebook ministry, and he's on every day on Facebook giving prophecies. He is still saying today, no, Trump actually did win the election. Like, this was the word of the Lord. He can't even piece together the reality of what's happening in the world with his own disappointments about what he thought he was seeing come to pass. So he is making reality bend to this like intuitive experience that he had, and he couldn't sift through in his own intuitive experience. So he's still going on telling people like, well, we know that Trump is actually, and he's diving into the QAnon conspiracy stuff. It's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking. Sorry, I talked way too long.
That was fascinating.
Yeah.
That also brings up the whole other subject of dreams, and how this interconnects with all of it. I think that's something that is interesting and lacking in sort of the current, charismatic prophecy space. Is I really like reading the church fathers. And when you read the church fathers, especially the earlier ones, like first couple centuries, you get glimpses of the charismatic stuff is still kind of happening, right? That they're still speaking in tongues, there's still prophets and stuff like that. And we kind of mentioned Montanism earlier. Montanism was sort of like proto-Pentecostalism or something like that. Because like you can imagine in the early church, like we already mentioned that virtually no charismatic circles that we know of think that modern prophecy is on a par with scripture, right? That very clear. Like Mormons kind of do, but that's a whole different subject. But back in the early church, you can imagine that divide wasn't clear at all, right? Like, there was no, like, it's obvious for us now, or so we think, that, okay, the letters of Paul, good. Letters of Peter, good. Revelation, good, right? And those other things that were considered at the time not good. But if you're a Christian in 100 or 150 AD, that's far less obvious, right? Which of these books and prophets floating around are genuine or not. And it was a real difficult question, because some people thought, well, look, the prophetic status that the apostles had is still alive now, right? And some people were kind of like, no, the apostles were more important, but there's still prophecy, kind of, right? And that was sort of the Montanist, disagreement. But even then, I think that what you can see in the early church and how they handled prophecy is that prophets were normally not at the top of the church hierarchy. Prophets were kind of perhaps at the normal laity level, and maybe it could be anyone, right? Some people might get really known for being prophets, but prophecy could come from anywhere. And then there was the discernment process, right? And even the Montanists seemingly had this, where it was like, okay, Paul, you just had an interesting dream about John McCain's tour bus. All right, let's talk about this, right? And let's weigh this, because maybe you're right, or maybe you just had some weird broccoli for dinner that night,
Totally.
Right? And they didn't think that all prophecy, or all possible prophecy, rose to the level of legitimate, say. And it wasn't like saying, it wasn't a bad thing to say about the prophet that, hey, we need to evaluate what you just said, right? And there was this kind of opposing process, right, to use sort of a Vervaekeism, that there was the kind of the non-prophetic people, and the First Corinthians talks about discerning spirits. Well, what did they mean by discerning spirits? Well, you could have all sorts of spirits that got you to talk, right? And the same person could at sometimes speak from good spirit and bad spirit, right? And so we need to use our discerning of spirits to know if Paul's dream about John McCain's tour bus was an actual prophecy or not. And I think that that sort of thing is lacking in modern charismatic practice, that sort of, sober evaluation of the prophecies, and kind of elevating people who are good at doing that bit. And right, you can even see this in like the pagan practices of the day, right? Like the oracles of Delphi, right? There was the ecstatic girls who would, be, probably something kind of similar to speaking in tongues. I don't mean to be,
No, totally.
I don't mean to be too blasphemous, but then there was the I forget what their job title was called, but they would then communicate, kind of like pull the stuff out of it, right? And it's sort of like the order and chaos thing, right? Because prophecy, and especially speaking in tongues, is like, it's like chaos, really, right? It's unstructured potential, kind of like booming into the church experience. And we need a balance of order and chaos, right? But kind of the ordering part of that is the discerning of spirits and stuff like that. And I think that you can see that in the early church. And I think that it's sort of lacking. And I think that that's because we elevate prophets perhaps too highly.
And there's no checks and balance system.
There's no checks and balance.
Our modern charismatic ministries. There is not. If you do challenge, if you are not on the same level in the hierarchy, right? So if you're just conference goer Joe or church member at whatever charismatic hub you want to name, and you have a disagreement with the person near the top of the hierarchy who's the prophet, what's your mechanism for bringing that? If you just make a post on social media, they'll delete it. Or you will be, and this is some of the characteristics of cult atmospheres that are really, really dangerous and fairly endemic to the org structures of these ministries and churches, is that when you are CEO and you're judge, jury, and executioner, and you don't have, like, you've got a board, but not really. It's not like a congregational church, like our senior pastor always says here, my senior pastor didn't hire me. Like, I had an interview with him at some point, but I was voted on as a pastor by the members of the church. Like, they voted me in, which is really weird for someone that grew up in charismatic culture. It was like, well, whoever the senior pastor wants to put is there. So there is no mechanism or checks and balance system there. And if you do challenge it, you're often accused of having a Pharisaical spirit. You're accused of bringing dissent. You're accused of, and there's a lot of hurts. This is some of the stuff that I'm so glad you guys have a perspective where you're trying to figure out ways of in a healthy manner, incorporate the best of that past into your ongoing journey with Jesus. But there's a lot of people that carry deep, deep hurts about this stuff, and they're valid hurts, and they go, I'm just walking away from all of it because when I brought it up, I wasn't listened to. It was a witch hunt, against me, all of these other things. It's very, very difficult.
And not to mention financial abuse, right? People, the prophet at the top, if they control the purse strings, and they're also saying stuff that can motivate people to give more money and stuff like that, and then mix that with prosperity gospel stuff, that can be very bad. And then sexual stuff too, that's always is there. A funny thing that I think is kind of interesting is like, so charismania is like the hyper Protestantism, right? It's like the Protestants of the Protestants of the Protestants, right? But in sort of a weird curved horseshoe sort of way, you can almost see that it's starting to get back to a church structure that looks kind of so hierarchical and almost bureaucratic, like the Catholic Church. And I almost really do think that the way that the Orthodox Catholic Church got its church structure was sort of like the organic outgrowth of something like the charismatic like nature of early Christianity. And like people will talk about, oh man, you know, I was appointed a prophet by this prophet, and there's like prophetic, or, you know, there's even like the new apostolic reformation or something like that, where you have to be appointed an apostle by an apostle. So they have apostolic succession, like really?
And that's a great insight.
And then they like venerate the dead ones, and it's like,
you can go get their mantle.
Right?
I went down to Keith Green's gravesite with some charismatic leaders who were, I was in person there. Even at the time, even in deep in charismania as I was never all right with this, who were like putting their hands on Keith Green's grave to get his mantle.
Okay, Catholics would be like, I know exactly what you're doing. I know exactly what that is. You are venerating a saint. That is what you are doing.
It's like, I don't know if this works, guys, but go for it.
Well, it's like you're going to this place where, oh, somebody saw a Marian apparition 1,000 years ago, and we're going to go and you know, there was this huge controversy over, you know, grave sucking a few.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Ago. Exactly. And you know, you totally understand, you know, like people have an issue with it, but at the same time, and I wouldn't approve of it, obviously, but it's the same thing that's been happening. And I think one of the kind of metaphors that we've been working on in the Bridges of Meaning, I don't know who came up with this, but you know, the charismaticism has the fire, but then the other traditions have the fireplace. Right. So there is
to give Sarah a shout out. Sarah.
Okay, Sarah. Okay. Yeah. I wasn't sure.
I'm going to steal that from you, Sarah. That's great.
Yeah. I thought it was super insightful because, like you all have said, like you need the hierarchy, you need the accountability. And, you know, I'm not convinced of a specific ecclesiological structure. Like we need to do it this way. We need to have a pope. We need it. I don't know. Right. But all of that is there. And like this sort of, all of these, you know, this sort of American individualism combined with evangelicalism, combined with this Protestant, you know, individual psychology, and then the charismatic stuff all kind of came together to create this, you know, this perfect storm almost. And I kind of want to riff on some of the things you shared, Paul, because that was super fascinating. Because I was wondering, you know, every next time I would hear some internet prophet, or, you know, I wouldn't seek them out, but my mom would normally most of the time, right? You know, bless her heart, she's great. But I was wondering, I was like, okay, are there any prophets who are declaring that Joe Biden will be the president? You know, if there are, what do we do with them? What do we do when we have this disagreement? And I think two kind of, you know, in flux solutions that I have are maybe, or at least ways of addressing it might be, first of all, let's dial down the future prediction aspect of it. Let's have, like, you know, the way that prophetic words have operated in my life is like it's a calling to more intimacy with God, and there's specific aspects that, you know, people have called out that they would not have known that because they don't know who I am, you know, about my life. And so
I think that's the New Testament gift of prophecy versus the Old Testament office of the prophet, which I don't really know is. I just wanted to say that I think that's a New Testament affirmation. You know, that is something to value, and we should actually desire prophecy above all the other spiritual gifts. That's what Paul says. Yep,
exactly. Yeah, and that's, I mean, that's another difference to pull out for non-charismatic folks, is that we're not saying that we're Elijah and we're, you know, raining down destruction on you know, Israel or the other nations or whatever. It's like you said, Paul. It's very much it's the way I've always heard it described is it's an invitation into pursuing more of God's presence. And this is all, you know, charismatic lingo, but I think it's the easiest way for me to express it. So I think if we push, I mean, I would say number one, if we push more into like less future prediction, more in let's challenge individuals, let's challenge the church as a corporate body to move into God's purpose. And maybe that does have to do with specific events, being a mediator between these two giants that are destroying each other. I like that image. Let's do more stuff like that. And then I think secondly, what we've already talked about is putting the fireplace over the fire, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that, that seems like a very, it would take a very large cultural shift in charismaticism as a whole for that to happen, because it's so individual, it's so destructured, decentralized. Anyone could get on and say anything you want.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so that's like, we need some sort of wide scale ecclesiological structure. And I'm not saying that I have the right answer to that, because that's a complicated question, and different denominations have had different answers to that. But I think there is a room for, let's let these prophetic gifts flourish. Definitely. And let's also have these safeguards to keep them from being abused.
Definitely.
Yeah.
You guys are probably familiar with John Wimber, right? John Wimber is the founder of Vineyard Churches. And I think in many ways, the Vineyard has done the best job. This isn't a paid advertisement for the Vineyard. I have some dear friends that are in the Vineyard. And I think in a lot of ways, the Vineyard has done probably the best job among charismatic denominations as to not veering into Gnosticism, not getting involved in, being able to somehow unplug, I think, from a lot of the elements of culture war Christianity. But John Wimber early on, when he had his born again experience, there's this fun anecdote. John Wimber went and visited he was, sex, drugs, and rock and roll musician. And then he, encountered the grace of Jesus, and then was devouring reading the Bible on his own. And then he goes to a church. He's like, well, I should probably go to a church, visits this church. He hears a sermon, and then he goes up to like an usher or somebody, and he goes, wow, that was really great. When do we get to do the stuff? And the guy's like, what do you mean do the stuff? He's like, the stuff I've been reading Jesus and in the book of Acts, like, when do we get to heal the sick and raise the dead and cast out demons? And the guy's like, oh, you might be looking for a different church down the road. And I think one of the best things about Wimber's attitude, Wimber would always say, you get to do the stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So the Protestant thing that you mentioned, Sam, there's a healthy Protestant ethos, which is this priesthood of all believers. We have one mediator in Christ Jesus between God and man. That you have been, the Holy Spirit's been poured out on all flesh, and you can do the stuff. Well, Jesus, what if we see someone else casting out demons? What does Jesus say? They're doing it in my name. Great. Mm-hmm. Like, you can do the stuff. Simultaneously, though, once people get really good at doing this stuff, a hierarchy does develop naturally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sort of like Peterson's insight, and anytime you value something, then it immediately creates a hierarchy of who's good and less good at it.
Yes. So we need to be critically assessing those hierarchies around more than just spiritual gifting. And there's biblical instruction for what's the qualifications for those that should be in leadership. And, the org side of it is messy. I don't, like you're saying, John, I don't have a solution for, well, what's the best container for this? I actually think it's probably an ever always adapting and evolving container to fit the proper cultural context that we're always in, and to adapt to meet the needs of a cultural context. I don't know if it's always static, but there are some concerns that I think we would have about church structures organized around people's giftings, spiritual giftings primarily, and then those spiritual giftings propelling them to a status that is like this, instead of it's a constant upward movement instead of a constant downward movement. I have a friend, charismatic pastor, and I love him to death, and he said this to me years ago, and it was always so profound, and I'm appreciative of him, and I think he's really trying to hold to this the best that he can in his culture. The ladder down is always the stairway up in the kingdom of God. And so it's concerning to me. I've been in conferences where I was waited on hand and foot. And I was just like either the worship leader or a guitar player for some other worship leader with 7-course meals. And there was, God bless the people doing it, but I didn't see it reciprocated from those that moved to the top of the hierarchy. There wasn't an embodiment of the pattern of Jesus's life and ministry, right? It wasn't the Christ hymn of Philippians, though being God did not consider equality with
Form
God.
of God.
The form, yeah. Are you? Oh, you know what? Now we're getting to. I'm recalling some conversations you've had with Paul. Yeah.
I didn't mean to bring it up. I was just teasing.
But regardless of that distinction, which is an important one, that pattern isn't embodied, and it's still the American CEO model, and that's where these dangers go unchecked, and I think they create a lot of harm. So at least having a constant conversation about, does our structure lead to our leaders being servants?
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, if we see the development of narcissistic traits, part of it is because we've allowed that structure to continue, a structure that you only get to the top through narcissism.
Right. And egoism. Yeah. So like one thing that I really hope for kind of this corner of the internet, the estuary, the stuff around Paul Vanderklay, et cetera, is that, the Discord sometimes just has a lot of different theological traditions arguing with each other about, Mary or this or that or the other thing. But one thing that I really hope is like to bring in Vervaeke's 4 Ps. I think you can think of that as like the 4 cylinders of like the spiritual engine that need to be firing. Like there's the propositional, right? And let's say non-charismatic, especially like Reformed evangelicalism is really good at the propositional, right? Doctrines, here's why we believe what we believe, here's our whole systematic theology, etc. But like you could say propositional idolatry is thinking that that's all that there is to faith, or what saves you is simply affirming the right combination of propositions. But that's an important ingredient. Another important ingredient is the perspectival. And I feel like that's what charismaticism is really good at, the experience of worshiping God. Like what you were talking about, Paul, you were really good at leading the worship experiences to get people into the flow state and to have the Spirit at work, to bring the people into the presence of God, et cetera, et cetera. That sort of, I can feel it sort of thing, right? That's what charismaticism is really good at. What you could call perspectival idolatry is saying those experiences are what saves you, right? Having that experience of the Spirit that's salvation, right? Perhaps that can get elevated too high. Let's hear participatory. Like the Catholics are good at that. Just be part of our church, and you'll be saved, right? We are the true church. Come participate with us, and the participatory idolatry is just be part of our church and you're saved.
Interesting. Right? I've been thinking of it as the participation having more in alignment with the charismatic and Pentecostal.
Yeah, because there's a group thing. Yeah,
I wouldn't want to argue
kind of both,
as well, but
right.
Because I think of it as the participation, the invitation into all of our language of experience and presence. What are we talking about? We're talking about like that. We're looking for union, right? We're looking for that. That's not a critique of this thesis at all, John, but it's interesting to think about it. I think it works either way. You're giving me a different framework, because I was thinking of the perspectival as like the liturgical, because we're giving you like teaching you how to throw a baseball.
I would have called that the procedural. Like the last thing
procedural. You're right.
Like,
I'm sorry. Procedural. That's what I meant to say.
The Orthodox are really good at the procedural.
Yes, that's what I meant to say.
Just do this liturgy and you will be saved, right?
Yes.
God works in this liturgy. We do these procedures. We've inherited these from John Chrysostom. I never know how to pronounce his name, etc. Just this is our sacred liturgy. Do it, right? And I think that there are truths to all of those things. Yes, you need propositions. Yes, you need the experience of what it's like to be a Christian to really feel it from the inside. Yes, you need to be part of a group that's doing it together, and you need to participate with God. And yes, some good procedures are healthy. And so I feel like bringing the strengths from all of these traditions, if we can kind of unite them and build good fireplaces and communities, that's really what I would hope is, this cross-fertilization that could happen.
You should, if you haven't, but I'd encourage, you should write something about that, Sam, even just a blog or an article. I think that's a great framework that I'd find really helpful in referring to, actually naming specifically. That's really good.
I'd second that. I don't have anything necessarily to add on that point. I just like just chewing over it myself. I found Vervaeke's heuristic so helpful. And especially, listening to both of you guys have now had conversations with him, and being able to hear you guys, pull that out with him. I think it's going to be, if we can, if we can think about that more and think about like that as a framework of implementation, I think it will make a lot of progress on some of these fronts, like the prophetic stuff and a lot of these other charismatic gifts that otherwise are sort of odd ducks out in the Christian tradition. They can be properly integrated. So
yeah, it's funny. I just have to say about my Vervaeke conversation, the number one positive feedback I got from people was from charismatics.
Yeah.
Who listened to
100%. Yeah.
They got what he was talking about. And, there were some questions about it. There's questions about, boy, are we just reducing this all to, biological, psychological experiences in our brain, the flow state and altered states of consciousness. And I try to assure people, no, I think these are bottom-up descriptions of the way the spirit is always, it's always mediated. It's always mediated through our body. But charismatics, I think Vervaeke's 4P framework, which again is just a bottom-up description of something. It's not like Vervaeke's here and then we have to find the experiences that match, just to be, not to turn him into a saint. But it was interesting to see so many charismatic friends that I have that were like, oh my gosh, that names everything that I've been experiencing and working through. So I'd love, Sam, I'm not giving you a homework assignment. I'm just saying I would love if you fleshed that out in some written form. I'd love to read it.
All right. Well, thanks. Yeah. And you gave me the courage, Paul, to reach out to Vervaeke. I'd been a little intimidated by him, honestly. And then you had such a good conversation with him. I was like, okay, fine, I can do it too.
You don't know unless you ask. That's just been my thing. You just throw out, I've got a list of people that, I'm a nobody, I don't have, I'm not a professor somewhere, but you reach out and worst they can say is no. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Well, I should probably get going pretty soon. Anyone have any closing thoughts they want to get off their chest?
I just say I had this conversation was really great, and I'm glad we were able to squeeze in the Vervaeke stuff at the end, because like both of you have said, it's just and especially the last 45 minutes, half hour of your conversation with Vervaeke, Paul, it was like, I second all of the stuff that you've heard, because it was so enlightening for me, and it helped me understand that so much better. So, I just say, if anyone charismatic or not wants to hear, to really connect these two things, definitely go listen to your conversation with that.
Oh, thanks guys. This was a blast to do. Yes, Sam, feel free, if you get some time, to just Google Drive me the files for this, because I might, if it's okay, even want to post it.
Absolutely.
I might share it with my patrons on Patreon. I think it's maybe a good inside discussion,
Cool. Yeah. I'll send it over to you, and I'll send it to Jeff Pace to upload to Randos.
Okay. Awesome. Thanks,
All right.
guys. This was fun.
Good. Thanks, guys.